In the workshop, a Stuart Sirius steam engine, part 2, modifying the steam manifold. So what's wrong with the steam manifold? Well, the casting's a bit rough, and there's a steam leak around the drain cock fitting. This is called a banjo union. It's a modified bolt that clamps the manifold to the engine. Pressure gauge siphons are often fitted to boilers using the same principle. This manifold is quite a substantial casting. It's held in position at the bottom by a small bolt, and you will notice that the crankcase is specially shaped to accommodate this bolt. This engine does not look like a home-built engine. As a guess, I would think that this engine was originally built in World War II by Stuart to become the power plant, built into a generating set that would have been parachute dropped into enemy territory during World War II, where they would have been used to power radios. So these are the parts that I have to play with. The displacement lubricator is too small, the drain cock is unnecessary, and as I said earlier, where the drain cock screws into the fitting, it leaks. First of all, I remove the small displacement lubricator, and here I'm removing the drain cock. I'm going to put this back in my box of assorted drain cock parts. And it's just as I thought. Here is some soft solder that's been very badly applied to seal the fitting where it fits the manifold. As I turn over the manifold, you can see that this is definitely a separate part that's fitted to it. Apart from that, the manifold looks pretty well made. Time now to remove the soft solder. You must never use soft solder on an inlet manifold to an engine if it's going to be run using superheated steam, because the superheated steam will just melt the solder. That probably explains why there's a big blob of solder at the lowest part of the manifold when it's fastened to the engine. So all I'm doing here is heating up the manifold with the blowtorch and using a wire brush to brush away the solder, and hopefully while the part is at this temperature I should easily be able to remove this threaded bush. It was obvious to me that this bush was threaded internally, but I was very pleased to see that it was also threaded externally, and it came out of the manifold very easily. A few more applications of the wire brush removes most of the solder from around the joint. This threaded part of the manifold is not part of the casting, it's been silver soldered in place. In this clip I'm unscrewing the casting from the brass adapter that fits in the end of it. All I have to do now is let the casting cool, and then using my polishing spindle I can clean it up. You will notice that I never use gloves in the workshop, and I don't use gloves when I'm using the polishing spindle. That's because I do like to know where my fingers are at all times. The brown block that you saw me touch on the wheel at the beginning of this sequence is called soap, and it's an abrasive. The top of the casting was a little bit uneven, so I used my 1-inch belt sander to clean it up a bit. But all that really happened was the manifold got very hot and burnt my fingers, so I changed the sanding belt for a new one, and that was much better. Now it's back over to the polishing spindle, and after another application of the abrasive soap, I can remove the scratch marks made by the sanding belt. I now need to clean up the end of the manifold, but I don't want to round the edges by using the polishing spindle, so I put it in the lathe and just turned the end of it. And whilst I was still in lathe mode, I thought I would hold the adapter by the threads very lightly and skim the outside edge. It really is never good policy to hold items by the threads in a lathe. A much better idea would be to put a piece of metal in the chuck, drill it and thread it, and screw the adapter into that. Alternatively, you could use a nut in the chuck and screw your part into the nut. It's really time versus the importance of the component that you're machining. If this job was to go wrong, it's a fairly simple job to make another adapter. But generally when holding things by the thread, just take light cuts and it'll be okay. This is the drain cock that I removed from the adapter, and it's now gone into my box of assorted drain cock bits and pieces. I'm going to fit this threaded adapter back into the manifold using some Loctite 542. But I'm not putting the adapter in with a pair of pliers. I put it in the chuck and screw the manifold onto it. Now I can refit the manifold to the engine, and to my eye this looks a lot better than it did before I started cleaning it up. Even though this small bolt is not the nicest example of a small bolt that I've ever seen, I'm still going to use it because it's an original part of the engine. As always, I'm using my excellent Barco adjustable spanner to tighten the nut on the banjo union. And even though various experts at different times have warned me about rounding the edges of nuts using adjustable spanners, My barcode doesn't do this, and I recommend them to everyone. I'm going to reuse the end thread adapter. This has been threaded 5/16 by 40 threads per inch, which is fairly unusual. I don't know why this is the case really. Maybe the original engine's manifold had a hole threaded 5/16 by 40 threads per inch in the end of it. I don't know. The outside end of the adapter is threaded 5/16 by 32 threads per inch, so I'll be able to use a normal commercial 5/16 by 32 union nut on this. I'm going to fit a Stuart Models displacement lubricator in this position, but for the moment I thought I would just put a blanking plug in place. This internal thread of the adapter is 1/4 by 32 threads per inch. I think it's looking much better. This is what I started with, and this is what it looks like now. It's time to test it to make sure it doesn't leak. This is not slow motion, it really does run at this speed. As you can see in this clip, I've also cleaned up the top of the oil filler cap. In a future episode, I'm going to repaint this engine. So viewers, what colour should it be? My instincts tell me it should be Stuart green, but I quite like the red. Maybe I should paint it Crimson Lake, like LMS steam locomotives. But for now, I'm going to leave it as it is. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.